Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. We're excited to be here to discuss the transition to executive roles in management. And my name is Barry Roberts. I'm working here at the Wisconsin School of Business in the Center for Professional and Executive Development. And I've been in the school for 20 years and in executive education for the last 5, and been working with this program for the last 2 years. And also with me is Steve King, who is our retiring Executive Director for the Center for Professional and Executive Development. He's also the founder of the program and teaches in the program and is a coach with individual feedback in the program. So he's a great resource, and we're going to be interviewing Steve here today to talk about transition to executive management and leadership in general, along with a little bit later some information on the program itself. We also will have question and answer period later, and so you can use the chat function to submit questions to Steve and myself, and then we will respond to those a little later. And you'll also be receiving information via email regarding registration for the program if you're interested in that also. So with that, I think we'll begin our conversation about transitioning to an executive leadership role. So Steve, tell me a little bit about your experience with senior executive programs.
And first of all, welcome everybody, and thanks, Barry.
Yep.
So I've been with the university about 5 years, but prior to that I spent about 30 years in corporate settings in the Chicagoland area. And in the 3 organizations I sat in, BMO Harris, Bank of Montreal Harris Bank, Hewitt Associates, and Baxter Healthcare, I was responsible for executive education in all of those spaces. And what I found is I was in either case, either buying or building these programs. So for example, when I was at Harris Bank, I was a buyer. And what that means is that as executives were entering into executive roles, I would search for the kinds of programs around the country, or in some cases outside the country, that were the right fit for them. When I moved up to the Bank of Montreal up in Toronto, we actually built the program up there. So built an executive program, which is a 3-week program, and pretty successful for the bank. When I moved over to Hewitt Associates, I went back to being a buyer. And there I was actually spending a lot of time looking at the best programs for senior leaders or people becoming senior leaders. And when I finally ended up over at Baxter, we were a builder again, as we worked with various institutions and universities to build programs for Baxter. So when I arrived here at the university, one of the first things the Dean of Business School said was, we need a program like TEM. And your background allows us to kind of build this program around those experiences. So that's what yielded us an opportunity to build TEM.
So the goal of the program is to help people transition into executive leadership roles. What are some of the things that are most difficult for a leader transitioning to an executive role?
Well, for each individual leader, it's probably something a little different, but there are some commonalities, I think, for a lot of leaders. So here's 3 that kind of come to mind. First, I think that often there's a gap in some kind of business acumen when a leader goes from the middle part of the organization to an executive role. So they may have, for example, arrived in that executive role with a lot of finance, or they might come with a lot of background in marketing, but they may not have a lot of backgrounds in operations or supply chain. So they usually come prepared in some component of business acumen, but not all of it. So we need to fill that gap. Secondly, the whole scope of their, I'll call it their organizational design responsibilities, just gets much larger. So for example, when they enter into an executive role, often they take responsibility for integrating multiple processes across an organization. That is easily a new task for them, and there's some gap there in how to do that. Culture would be another one. They're usually, by then, pretty adept at thinking about culture, but having to manage both large cultures and subcultures and aligning all those simultaneously, that's probably a new kind of skill set that they need to build as well. And then third, I think, and maybe most importantly, I think that the ability to read business context, the ability to look at a business landscape and say, these things are changing in my marketplace, These things are changing in my industry. Technology is shifting and changing. Compliance and regulatory rules are changing. The ability to recognize those changes and being able to adapt them and adjust their organization accordingly, this is often a big gap because they've usually not had to work in such a contextual framework or a shifting contextual framework. So I think those three things are often issues for people that come in to executive roles.
Okay, great. Now you've transitioned yourself into executive roles, and you've helped a lot of people do that. So how does a person's perspective change when you get into a high-level leadership role?
Yeah, and I will admit that I struggle with this myself as I moved into a C-suite roles myself. So one area I think that's pretty common that's sort of a shift in perspective is you become much more systemic in your thinking process. Systems thinking, we'll call it that, becomes significantly more important in an executive suite. I think that's key. That shifts for a lot of people. Secondly, sort of ties to what I said earlier, an outward focus towards the marketplace, I think towards industry, is also a shift in perspective. I think there is a shift in the way we think about followership. So when you're in the middle of the organization, typically you know all the people that report to you, or either they report to you or report to the people that report to you. But when you become a senior executive, often you are leading very, very large groups of people, many of whom you do not know. So I think there's this whole shift in perspective around followership, around how you describe your mission and your vision, how you take on change management, sponsorship responsibilities, how you're sort of present in the marketplace. I think that's different for an executive. And then finally, I would say you, oddly enough, rely more on your wisdom and your belief systems and your ability to make assumptions, wise and thoughtful assumptions in executive roles, actually more than you probably do at more junior roles. Because the data you receive as a senior executive is often either one sanitized for you or very contradictory. And so you really got to lay in some judgment, some wisdom into the process, and I think that's a new perspective as well.
Okay, thank you. And so you've been through this process and helped a lot of people make the transition. What have you seen as being effective ways to prepare for taking on a high-level leadership role?
Well, I think the preparation for a senior role is really no different in many ways than the preparation for any role. So that old adage of 70-20-10 applies here for executives just like it does for anyone else. So in the spirit of 70, meaning experience, most of us learn things by doing them on the job. And so I always encourage people that were transitioning to executive roles to take on as many executive tasks as possible in that transition. So for example, if you get the opportunity to be on an M&A team, you should grab it, because I think that's a really important opportunity for you to learn. If you get the opportunity to be on an implementation team for an ERP, you should grab it. I know that's a difficult task to do, but I think it's a wonderful learning experience for an executive. If you get a chance to be on a workforce planning team, that would be another one, or a market expansion team, another one. You kind of get the drift. It's those experiences. By the way, some of these experiences can happen outside the organization as well. So for me personally, I had become a member of a local school board, and I was on the school board for 12 years. I think that experience of being on the school board really helped me think about my leadership responsibilities, and just the experiences themselves were very valuable to my development. So I would say grab any experience you can that's sort of an executive experience that helps you get there. In the spirit of the 20% of the 70-20-10, get as many coaches and mentors as you possibly can that come from different perspectives. Ask them lots of questions, listen carefully, be prepared for conversations that are important to you about what they have learned and what wisdom they can provide you. So I always encourage people moving into executive roles to find themselves coaches, more than one, ideally. And then finally, when you're in the middle of a transition, I think any kind of professional transition, I think it's a good time to take up a class and go to a program. So for example, if you are shifting to becoming a project manager, you should go to a project management class. I think if someone's moving into an executive role, they need to search for programs like Transition to Executive Management, because I think it gives them some rudimentary skill sets they'll need and understanding of the basic things they will need in their executive position.
So building on that a little bit, how does the current transition to executive management program here at the Wisconsin School of Business help people make this transition successfully?
Well, when I think about this particular program, I think of it in sort of three chunks. So what we've attempted to do is the following things. First, we really laid out a lot of, I call it classic business acumen in the program. Things like strategy, operations, marketing, supply chains, things of that nature. Because I really believe that you need a foundation of this kind of basic business acumen to be able to read context well and to make the calls you need to make as a senior executive. So that'd be one. Second one would be leadership. So we place a lot of leadership discussions into the program. We focus on very specific things that we know senior executives will face. So for example, it's not uncommon for senior executives to have to manage very matrix organizations, so we want to make certain that they understand that. Part and parcel with that leadership piece is we integrate into the program a 360 tool that focuses on their leadership capabilities and their leadership productivity. Now, we have chosen a 360 tool that's a little different than most. This is not a styles tool. This is actually a tool that measures the intention of the leader and how they intend to impact those that they interact with in the organization, their boss, their peers, their staff. And it also measures how those three groups, boss, peers, and staff, actually feel impacted by the leader. So this is really a measurement of how you intend to and actually do impact the productivity of others. We love the tool, and we have found from past participants, they walk out really happy with that tool. And then finally, we really want to make sure the program deals with this issue of context. So we will actually be looking at things like, how does new advancing technologies influence the industry? Or for example, how does a changing workforce that's more millennial and more diverse influence an organization? So we put up on the screen 3 examples. There's about a dozen instructors that we use throughout the program. But just to highlight these 3 categories here, on the business acumen side, Enno is really an outstanding guy. He's a faculty member at the business school. One of his books is on basically the relationship between inventory and sales and the relationship of the supply and demand. Great guy, and for those that come to the program, they learn a lot on the kind of key business acumen that's faced. In the area of managing a matrix, we have Susan Finnerty, and Susan is a person who's spent a great deal of time inside organizations and then kind of busted out with her own research in this space. And we have found organizations and this particular program really useful for her to kind of come in and spend some time talking about the ins and outs of matrix. And then in the area of context, as an example, we are reached out to a professor at Morehouse College in Atlanta who has a specialty in looking at both millennials and race relations inside organizations, because we think that context is really important for leaders, particularly moving forward. So Belinda White and her book, we think really brings something to the party as well. Now, these are not the only instructors in the program, but they sort of illustrate the kind of muscle we think we're going to bring in. The key here, though, is business acumen, context, leadership. These are the elements of how we kind of put together this particular program. Now, one last thing. You also have the issue of cohorts here, and that is when a group of people come together, we try to keep the group small, so we anticipate that we'll have no more than 22 people in the program. And why we like the intimacy of that is because of the networking that takes place. This is a group of people that spend a lot of time together. They learn from one another, and what we have found, as we would expect, they become pretty close to each other. And they all tell us afterwards, even afterwards, as in months or years afterwards, they're still in contact with each other, and they're still learning and using those resources. So that is a really critical part of the program. It isn't that we plan for it per se, it just happens.
So speaking of that, who comes to this program?
Oh, yeah, the mix of people in the program. So here's what we've experienced. You know, the mix is kind of interesting. What we get is we get people on, I'll call it the business side of the business, or in that transitional moment where they're actually going from maybe a director level role to a VP role, or a VP role to a senior VP role. In that transitional moment, it's not uncommon for us to find people like that. Secondly, we often find functional leaders coming to the program. So let's use some examples. HR, IT, real estate, legal. What we often find is people have risen to the high levels of those functions, but they don't have a lot of background in business acumen. And so what they're looking for is they're looking for to kind of get that foundational piece that they may not have gotten before. And so it's usually a mix between these two kinds of people in the program, then great. And matter of fact, a lot of past participants said it's been nice to have the functional leaders in place to kind of keep them honest about what happens on their side of the business, and then vice versa as well. Maybe one other point. There's an old term, which still some companies use and some don't, called general managers or general management. And I think we find that a lot of people that are kind of headed towards or becoming general managers are often in this program as well.
Yes, and it is a very tight group that gets formed through these cohorts, and it's pretty exciting. They support each other, and the last cohort we had, since this is 3 sessions a month apart, between session 2 and 3, 2 of them got promoted into higher executive roles, and so there was a lot of celebrating around that, and that's pretty common. We can also take questions. If you want to enter any questions into chat, we can do that.
In the meantime, I'll just make one other comment. I had said at the beginning that this program was something that our dean was eager to have, but I will tell you that these are exactly the kinds of programs that senior executives are looking for their senior executives to go to. So for example, when I was at Baxter, the CEO was very clear that he wanted to build a cohort of general managers. Now, he had the ability to place individuals in roles all around the world as what he called them country managers, but he was also looking for programs that allowed them to build some skills to prepare them for those roles as general manager, country managers as well. So this request for these kinds of programs not only just come from deans of business schools, they actually come from businesses themselves who see value in them.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment, correct? So
maybe I'll just make one kind of wrap up with a couple other comments. So this center, what we call the Center for Professional and Executive Development, this center's real mission is to help professionals through these professional transitional moments. And so we actually do see ourselves as sort of partners in these transitional moments, whether that transitional moment is someone going from an individual contributor to a frontline supervisor, whether it's from a frontline supervisor to somewhere in the middle of the organization, or whether it's this kind of executive transition that we're talking about here. We actually feel that we're really become specialists in actually helping people through these transitions, and then associated with that, the organizational transitions that go along with it when organizations are transforming themselves. So this sort of fits right in our sweet spot. That's why we call the program Transition to Executive Management.
So we do have a question here, a very good question. What are some of the major pitfalls to avoid early in the transition to executive leadership? So what are some pitfalls to avoid when you're transitioning to executive?
Well, this is going to sound odd, but actually I think a lot of people are just like over-eager to do a bunch of stuff. And I think that, not that you should just sit back and listen for a full year, because that's probably not what you do, but I think that you need to pick and choose what's going to be a really impactful thing for you to do early on. So here's a rule of thumb that I usually use with executives. A lot of executives show up and say one of the first things they want to do is restructure stuff. And I try to dissuade them from that, because I think that restructuring is sort of step 4, 5, or 6 behind things like being clear about mission and vision and strategy, and clarifying what your key processes are and how those processes are running, or what the culture of your organization looks like, or what are the core competencies. And so I think that it's about picking the critical few things you want to focus on early rather than just rush in and do that. Secondly, I would say make sure you leverage the talent around you. There is no senior executive I've ever met, well, almost all of them are smart, that are so smart they can do it all themselves. And so really, it's the team around you that's really going to support and drive, I think, some success here. So tend to the team, pick your battles, I think are some of the early things you want to do.
Do you have any specific examples of where someone has failed in that transition? And why? And why?
And why? Yeah, sure. So I worked in one organization in which by the time when I arrived in the organization, the following phenomenon was happening. 1 out of every 3 VPs that were hired were gone within 3 years. Now that is a problem. And so we had to dig underneath to figure out why that was, why we were hiring what seemed to be remarkably qualified senior executives, and they were actually not doing well. And why they failed? Here's what it turned out to be. We were hiring remarkably technically savvy people. They were good at their technical skill sets of what they did really well. They had great communication skills. They carried a lot of the things you'd call good leadership skills. But because the organization was a deeply matrix organization, what we found is they lacked the ability to influence without authority. And so in this organization, they went through probably as many as 5 years of failing executive groups, individuals, largely because they didn't pinpoint that their culture of matrix forming the culture was actually requiring a higher level of influence skills than many people are going to have. So that would be a great example, I think, of we could see the failure happening. We had to deduce and figure out why it was the case.
And I imagine that's become more the case with matrix organizations and the way things work these days.
Oh, absolutely, which is, by the way, why we actually emphasize matrix management or matrix leadership in the program, because we know that more and more organizations are finding that individuals are just reporting to more than one individual, and that's a dicey moment.
Any thoughts on how you identify people that are ready to, would be good executive leaders?
Yeah, so, well, the answer is yeah. So you've got assessment tools, and there's a slew of them out there that are pretty good. Often they're associated with search firms who have really done a great piece of work in the last 20 years building these. And I think some of the assessment tools can really help identify the readiness of an executive to move from one role to another. Now, that assessment tool needs to be tied to clear role profiles and clear understanding of what an executive job is going to be. Secondly, I think you really need to have a good internal succession management system that's calibrating how this individual is growing over time and placing them properly in the succession plan, building development plans for them that prepare them for the roles that they need. So these are some of the things you can definitely do to prepare somebody.
Thank you. That's great. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap up. And thank everyone for being here. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Oh, we got another question. What do you anticipate the biggest challenges in executive management will be in the next 20 years?
Well, you may have heard when I introduced, I'm the retiring executive director, which means 20 years is a long distance out there for me. So, but some of the things that I think are contextual are really the issues at hand. So let's imagine a few of these. Globalization. We know this has been a pattern of an issue for 20 years. It's going to continue to be a pattern for 20 years. So I think that the whole issue of globalization as a context is really key. Diversity in the workplace, I think, is going to continue to be an issue for both U.S.-based companies, but I think eventually companies around the world. Regulatory issues. Right now, the regulatory issues in the U.S. are quite different than the regulatory issues in Europe. And the regulatory issues in Europe are changing rapidly with Brexit and other things happening. So you've got those kinds of issues. All this to say is it's the contextual things that I think are really going to be the challenge. So the better you are at reading context and adjusting it to it is probably going to make you a stronger executive leader.
Great. Thank you. All right. So that's been some great information on making the transition to executive roles and how this program, the Transition to Executive Management here at the Wisconsin School of Business, can help you and anyone else in your organization make that transition. So thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, everyone who's online, and you'll receive the website there and the phone number, and you'll be receiving an email with registration and other program information. So thank you all. Everyone have a great day.
Are we out?